They said the air was wrong when they opened the door. Too still, too heavy. Like the room itself had been holding its breath for years. The light from the deputy's flashlight found shapes that weren't supposed to be there. Small, motionless figures crouched in a circle, bare feet pressed into damp concrete. A child's hand twitched when the beam touched it, but the head didn't turn. None of them turned. There were 7 in total, all alive, all silent. The basement stank of iron and something sweet and rotten. Flies gathered around the walls, drawn to the stains that had long since dried black. One of the officers vomited into his own hand. Another whispered a prayer. They said the children's eyes were open, but the pupils didn't respond to light. Just wide. Glassy orbs reflecting the flashlight beam, as if they were mirrors instead of eyes. Someone noticed their chests rising and falling, all at the same time, as though one set of lungs had been divided among them. The youngest girl's lips moved soundlessly, repeating something over and over. A word maybe, or not a word at all. When they were led out into the night, the air outside made them flinch like animals dragged from a cave. They didn't cry. They didn't speak. They just turned, all together, to look back at the house. And the sound they made then wasn't a scream exactly. But it was close enough that men who'd fought in wars said it was worse. The farmhouse burned that night, though no one claimed to have lit it. And when the ashes cooled, the foundation was still warm underneath, like something was breathing through the earth itself. Which city are you watching from, and what time is it right now? It matters more than you think, because some stories are different at night. Some can only be heard when the world around you is asleep. The Darrington case isn't one of those tales whispered by old men in bars or embroidered into ghost stories told for thrill. It's a wound, one that Pennsylvania tried to cover with dirt and paperwork. But the soil here doesn't forget, and neither do the names carved into its underside. The Darrington farmhouse once stood just outside a town called Millhaven, a settlement so small that no map, after 1969, even bothered to label it. It sat at the end of a road that was more mud than gravel, wrapped by black pine and shale hills. People who lived there said the valley always had its own weather. Mists that refused to lift even at noon. Storms that rattled windows but never brought rain. The place was old, not in the way of buildings or birth records, but in the bones of the ground. There were quarries nearby, fissures that breathed cold air from deep below, as if the land itself was exhaling something ancient. In the county archives, before they were sealed, there's a census entry from 1966 listing the Darringtons, Thomas, Eleanor, and their 7 children. Normal enough. Until you look closer. The handwriting of the census taker trembles on that page. The ink pressed too deep, as though the pen itself resisted finishing the names. Every family around them noted birthplaces, church affiliations, schools attended. But for the Darringtons, those spaces are left empty, small, deliberate absences. No birth certificates were ever filed for the youngest 3. Old-timers used to say the Darrington line went back to before the township was even founded, before records were kept. Their ancestors came from the mountains, from settlements that don't exist anymore, families that folded inward generation after generation, until their bloodlines were more like circles than trees. When the coal company surveyed the valley in the 1930s, they found graves without markers, just stones arranged in spirals, deep in the woods behind the Darrington land. No one knew who buried them. No one wanted to. In the late 60s, the family seemed ordinary enough from a distance. Thomas worked at the feed mill, Eleanor played piano at church socials. But neighbors whispered that the children rarely left the property, and when they did, they spoke too softly and too slow, as though language itself hurt to form. Some of the younger ones would stand motionless at the edge of the field, staring north for hours, their eyes following something only they could see. By autumn of 1967, the whispers stopped. The Darrington home went quiet, and for 4 years, no one set foot on that road again. By the time the authorities finally returned to Millhaven in 1971, the town had already begun to die. The old feed mill was silent. The rail line that once carried coal out of the valley had rusted through its bolts. What few families remained lived behind locked doors, their porches rotting under a permanent canopy of fog. There was no laughter, no livestock, no Sunday bells. Just the slow hum of insects and the dull weight of silence that thickened with every passing year. The Darrington house sat at the end of Dyer Road. The last structure before the forest began swallowing what was left of the township. Its windows were boarded, and the front steps had collapsed inward. But the mailbox still bore their name in flaking white paint T, Darrington. Someone had carved a second word underneath, though no one could decide what it meant. Some said it was a date. Others swore it was a warning. The sheriff's department had come only because of the smell. A surveyor for the gas company had reported it first. A saw, metallic scent drifting from beneath the ground, heavy enough to make his horse rear back, and refuse to move forward. When they dug into the soil, they found layers of brick and concrete that shouldn't have been there. Something had been built underneath the Darrington property. Something deep. No one remembered Thomas ever purchasing building materials, and no permits existed for any kind of cellar. But the foundation was riddled with sealed shafts, narrow tunnels lined with river stone, spiraling downward. Deputies broke through one wall expecting a storm shelter or storage pit. What they found was a chamber, perfectly circular, 15 feet across, and dry as bone. The walls were covered with crude carvings, symbols arranged in loops and clusters. In the center lay 7 small beds made of straw and cloth, each marked with a handprint, in what looked like dried paint, except it wasn't paint. Further down, they found the remains of food, but it had rotted into something black and unrecognizable. There were jars filled with clear liquid, some containing small shapes that might once have been animal hearts. Others held teeth. Dozens of them, too small to belong to adults. A state investigator from Harrisburg was called in. His notes, still preserved in the sealed records, described the site as an inverted chapel, a place of gathering beneath the house, arranged with deliberate symmetry. He wrote that the carvings matched none of the known Appalachian folk sigils, and that the air temperature dropped nearly 10 degrees the deeper they went. And at the very bottom of the last shaft, where the earth began to close in on itself, they found a door made of oak and rusted iron bands. It had no hinges, no latch. Just a single word burned into the wood, Ratuaren. They didn't open it that day. They said it sounded hollow when tapped, but warmer than it should have been, like something living waited behind it. Pressing back against the boards from the other side, they opened the door 3 days later, not because they wanted to, but because of the noise. Deputies had sealed the property and left 2 men on watch overnight. Both would later refuse to speak on record, but one of them, a reserve named Caldwell, left a written account in his personal notebook. The paper was found decades later among his belongings after he passed. It started just before dawn. He wrote, Sounded like children humming under the ground. Not crying, humming. Same note, never stopping. You could feel it through your boots, like the soil was hollow and alive. By morning, the humming had stopped, and the decision was made to open the chamber. The iron-banded door was thicker than it appeared, almost 6 inches deep. Oak gone black with moisture. When they finally broke through, a second passage appeared behind it. This one slick with condensation and lined in slate. There was no smell of decay, no sign of animals. Just cold air that moved upward, as if something beneath had been exhaling for years. The tunnel ran no more than 20 feet before widening into a low room. Inside, the deputies found the children. 7 of them, alive. They were seated in a ring, backs straight, faces turned inward toward a pit carved directly into the floor. Their clothes, rags of linen and canvas, were damp but neatly arranged. Each child held the next one's hand, forming an unbroken circle. Their eyes were open. None spoke when the lights hit them. One of the older girls blinked once, then twice, before whispering something that the officers couldn't understand. A single word, repeated. Back. They were taken out one by one. When the rescuers tried to separate them, the youngest began to scream, a sound so high it cracked the microphone on the field recorder. The others didn't cry, didn't resist, but their eyes followed one another, like a silent agreement was being broken. At the local hospital in Harrisburg, the children were examined. Malnourished, but stable. Skin marked with faint bruises around the wrists, not from restraint, but from pressure, as if they had held each other's hands too tightly for too long. None spoke English fluently. The eldest, a boy around 15, communicated only through gestures. When shown a mirror, he froze and began muttering in a low, rhythmic tone, repeating syllables no one recognized. A linguistics specialist from the state university was brought in. She noted that the sounds the boy made didn't belong to any known language, but followed a strange internal logic, a cycle of consonants and breaths that seemed patterned, like prayer or code. When asked what lay below the pit in the chamber, the boy only tapped his chest 3 times and said a single, clear word, "Mother." No record indicates what that meant. But on the following night, as the children slept in the ward, the humming returned, soft, barely audible, coming not from their beds, but from the floor beneath them. Nurses swore the lights flickered each time it rose. The state sent in a psychologist, Ruth Halpern, to work with the Darrington children. She was patient, measured, the kind of woman who believed no mind was unreachable. Her first report was dated March 3, 1971. It began optimistically, describing the children as responsive, though dissociative, capable of eye contact and following instruction. By her third report, the tone had changed. She wrote that the younger ones spoke of mother constantly, but never in reference to Eleanor Darrington, the woman whose remains had been found weeks earlier, buried near the well. To them, mother wasn't a person. It was a place, a voice. Sometimes they pointed downward when they said the word, sometimes to their own ribs, like something inside them carried its echo. Dr. Halpern tried to trace the language patterns they used when describing her. The syllables were soft, circular, often looping into repetition. She noted that when one child began to hum this pattern, the others joined in automatically, their breathing synchronizing without prompting. It frightened her at first. Then it fascinated her. During one session, she asked where mother lived. The eldest boy drew a shape on the paper, not a house, not a person, but a spiral that coiled inward, until the pencil tore through the sheet. When she asked what Mother said to them, he paused for a long time and whispered, "She teaches us how to stay." "Stay where?" Halpern asked. "Inside," he replied. After that, the sessions became inconsistent. The children would sit motionless for hours, heads tilted slightly, as though listening to something only they could hear. When Halpern tried to separate them for individual interviews, the humming returned. Always the same tone, always in unison. The longer it went on, the more the walls seemed to vibrate. On the 5th day, the youngest girl, the one who had first spoken in the basement, began drawing again. Pages filled with black crayon. Dense and heavy, layered so thick the paper curled. Beneath the black, faint outlines of figures appeared. Long arms, faces without mouths, circles of hands around a hole. Halpern later admitted in her notes that she started dreaming of those drawings at night. She'd wake to the sound of low humming in her apartment, certain it was coming from the vents. Her colleagues told her it was stress, sleep deprivation, nothing more. But in her final recorded interview, 1 week before the children were moved to a state facility, her voice trembles. When they speak of Mother, she says, they touch the center of their chests as if she lives there. I think whatever the Darringtons worshipped, whatever they called up beneath that house, didn't stay in the soil. It came through them, and it's still there, waiting. That was the last note Dr. Halpern ever filed. 2 days later, she resigned. The official report lists her departure as emotional exhaustion. Unofficially, her neighbors reported strange noises from her apartment the night before she left. A rhythmic thumping from beneath the floorboards, and what sounded like children humming. The Darrington children were transferred under sealed order to the St. Mark's residential facility for youth, a state-run psychiatric home 2 hours north of Harrisburg. It was a quiet place, or had been, built in the 1920s for children orphaned by the mines. High stone walls, long corridors that smelled of antiseptic and chalk dust, rooms lined with narrow beds. The staff records note that they arrived just after midnight on April 9, 1971. 7 children, no surviving relatives, no personal belongings. Each was given a number rather than a name for the intake forms. Subject 1 through Subject 7. The staff nurse on duty, a woman named Caroline Reese, later told investigators that she felt watched from the moment they arrived. She said their eyes seemed to move together, that even the youngest boy mirrored the breathing pattern of the eldest without being told. When one blinked, the others followed half a second later, like an echo, slightly delayed. The first night passed without incident. Except for one thing, the facility's clocks stopped between 2:14 and 2:27 a.m. on every floor. Maintenance couldn't explain it. Power had not failed. The hands of each clock simply froze. When the minute hand began to move again, all 7 children were awake, sitting upright in their beds, staring at the same corner of the ceiling. 2 days later, Dr. Halpern's replacement, Dr. Leonard Shaw, began the observation phase. He noted that none of the children exhibited aggression or fear, but that their silence was cooperative, not vacant. They seemed to know when someone was about to speak, or when a question was about to be asked. They often turned their heads toward the person seconds before being addressed. In his early reports, Shaw speculated about shared trauma, extreme bonding, he called it. But his language shifted as the weeks went on. By May, his notes used a different word, synchrony. That was when the dreams began. Staff complained of hearing murmurs through the vents at night. A low, rolling hum that made the glass on the ward doors tremble. Nurses said they'd see the children moving in their sleep, hands twitching in slow unison, mouths opening and closing to words that weren't audible. When asked about it during morning check-ins, the children always gave the same response. Mother is teaching us. One evening, during mealtime, Subject 4 collapsed. When staff rushed to help, the other 6 children screamed simultaneously, clutching their chests as if feeling the same pain. Monitors recorded identical heart rate spikes in all 7, even though only one had actually fallen. Shaw was in the room. He wrote in his log that it was as though the body of one extended into the others. After that, they were kept apart. Separate wards, locked doors. It made no difference. By the 3rd night, the humming returned. Only this time, it came from beneath the building. Janitors found the floor tiles near the boiler room buckling. The concrete below them warm to the touch, pulsing faintly, almost like breath. Security cameras captured static each time the sound rose. When the chief orderly went down to inspect the sublevel, he found the walls wet with condensation and the air stiflingly hot. In the center of the corridor, etched into the floor by something sharp, was a spiral. The same design the eldest Darrington boy had drawn weeks earlier. The humming grew louder after that night. Then, suddenly, it stopped. All 7 children were found standing in their rooms at dawn, motionless, faces turned toward the floor. When staff entered, they spoke in perfect unison, the same strange syllables Dr. Halpern had described. Ma, am, mo. The lights flickered, and every clock in the facility reset itself to 2:14 a.m. That was the last time all 7 were ever seen together. When the morning staff arrived, the children were gone. Doors locked from the outside, windows bolted, no signs of forced exit. Bedsheets still warm, food trays untouched. At first, they thought it was a mass escape. 7 children slipping past night guards and cameras. But the security footage showed something stranger. At exactly 2:14 a.m., the video cut to static. When the feed resumed 20 minutes later, the rooms were empty. Every clock in St. Mark's had reset again. Every calendar page on the ward was found turned back one day. State police conducted a full search of the grounds. Drains, attics, utility tunnels, even the old cistern beneath the chapel. Nothing. The case was sealed within the week under Order 7-1B, classified as a containment matter. The staff were reassigned or dismissed under non-disclosure agreements. The Darrington children's files were marked, closed, but a few kept copies. One of them, an orderly named Reese, the same who'd first met the children on arrival, mailed her personal journal to her sister before she left the facility. That journal surfaced decades later in an estate sale, its pages brittle and water-stained. Her final entry was dated May 29, 1971. The hum hasn't stopped. Even without them here, I still hear it under the floors. The vents breathe when the lights go out. Sometimes, if I press my ear to the wall, I can hear children's voices. They're saying it backwards now. Not mother, just Retum. Over and over. After that, the journal ends. St. Mark's closed in 1973 after a boiler explosion destroyed much of the lower floor. The official story blamed gas leaks. But those who were there said the blast came from beneath the foundation. When recovery crews cleared the wreckage, they found something buried under the concrete, not bones, not bodies, a room, perfectly circular, 15 feet across. The same as the one under the Darrington farmhouse. The walls were lined with small handprints, pressed into the concrete while it was still wet. At the center of the floor was a spiral, charred, blackened. burned directly into the stone. A maintenance worker claimed the spiral was still warm when he touched it. He said it pulsed, faintly, like a slow heartbeat. The investigator on site ordered the chamber resealed immediately. 2 days later, St. Mark's was bulldozed, but the locals say the ground never cooled. Children in the nearby town of Ashfield began waking at night, humming the same soft tune, the one the Darringtons had been heard singing. Parents thought it was coincidence. Then their clocks started freezing at 2:14 a.m. Decades passed. St. Mark's was gone, replaced by overgrowth and the kind of silence that sits too heavy for birds to trust. The land was sold twice, both deals collapsing before paperwork could close. Locals avoided it. The ground there, they said. In 1994, a young reporter named Daniel Price from the Harrisburg Chronicle began researching the old Order 71B files. It was supposed to be a short feature, a forgotten mystery, column about rural institutions and vanished records. But Price had an obsession with the gaps, the missing pages. The edits made with black ink so heavy, it soaked through to the next sheet. He started visiting the people who had worked at St. Mark's. What few were still alive. Most refused to talk. One man, an orderly now in a nursing home, said only, "If you dig under the chapel, you'll hear them before you find them." That was enough for Price. He found the site, a field of cracked foundation and rusted pipes swallowed by vines. He came with a recorder, a flashlight, and one other thing, a copy of Dr. Halpin's old interview tapes, salvaged from a faculty archive box mislabeled Language Studies. There were 7 reels in total. Each one was labeled with a number, Subject 1 through Subject 7. The first 6 contained little more than faint breathing, humming, and a woman's calm voice asking questions in slow, deliberate tones. The 7th was different. Halfway through, the tape warped, and then, faintly beneath the distortion, came a second voice, low, layered, impossible to place. It didn't sound like a child. It didn't sound like an adult. It sounded like several voices speaking through one throat. "We are inside," it said. "We are staying." Price documented everything in his notes. Then he went back to the site that night. His recorder captured over 30 minutes of what experts later described as non-random resonance. A low-frequency hum, so consistent it interfered with nearby radio transmissions. The signal was measured at exactly 2.14 Hz. He never published the article. 3 days after his last recording, Price's car was found on the side of Dyer Road, the same road that once led to the Darrington property. The engine was running, the headlights still on. Inside the vehicle, the passenger seat was empty except for his tape recorder. The tape was still spinning. When police played it back, they heard nothing but static, until the final minute. When the sound shifted, it was the same melody the Darrington children had hummed 50 years earlier. And at the end of it, a whisper, "Mother is open." After that, the tape disintegrated. The oxide layer peeled from the reel like burnt skin. The case was reopened briefly, then buried again under a new Order 94A. The official statement said Price likely succumbed to exposure. His remains were never found. But locals still tell stories of that stretch of road, the way radios crackle at 2:14 a.m., the way car engines stall if you stop too long. Some say you can still hear the hum beneath the soil, faint but steady, like something breathing under the skin of the earth. For 50 years, the Darrington file stayed sealed, buried under layers of bureaucracy and dust. But in 2021, during a state archive digitization project, a mislabeled reel surfaced. The label reads simply, "Interview, Subject 3, Final, The tape was brittle, the edges flaking to dust. The technician who transferred it described the sound as alive with interference. A heartbeat of static pulsing behind every word. The transcript that follows was found attached to the digital file. It was unsigned, but the voice on the tape was female, steady, professional, likely Dr. Halpin. Interviewer: do you remember your home, child? The place before St. Mark's. Subject 3: hey pose. Yes. Interviewer: can you tell me where it was? Subject 3D. Under. Interviewer: under what? Subject 3: hey whispers. Everything. The tape hissed for nearly 20 seconds. Then a soft hum began, joined by a second, then a third, voices overlapping, building like a current of wind through hollow wood. Subject 3: she's coming back. Interviewer: ooh. Subject 3: mother. Interviewer: is she alive? Subject 30: alive is not the word. The technician noted that, at this exact moment, the audio waveform distorted. A surge of low-frequency resonance that made the speakers rattle. Then came a sound, faint but distinct, like fingers tapping the microphone from inside the device. Subject 3: she doesn't live below, she lives through. Interviewer: through what? Subject 3D: softly. Use. Then silence. No hum, no movement, just breath, and then, in a voice not belonging to either speaker, was stayed. The tape ends abruptly. That reel was the last physical evidence of the Darrington case. It was logged, archived, and, according to federal order, destroyed within a week. But the technician who transferred it kept a copy of the waveform file for testing. In 2022, she played it back at home using a spectrogram viewer, an audio tool that visualizes sound. When the image loaded, she froze. The waveform didn't look random. It was a shape, a spiral, perfect, symmetrical, and at its center, faintly outlined in the static, 7 small handprints pressed together. That file, too, vanished after she turned it in. Her statement was brief, but it's still preserved in the record. It wasn't noise, it was breathing. Today, the site of the Darrington farmhouse is gone, swallowed by forest and shale. The land is unmarked, unclaimed. Locals say no trees grow straight there, compasses fail, and at exactly 2:14 a.m., the air grows thick, heavy, and still. If you stand long enough in that silence, long enough to feel the ground beneath your feet begin to pulse, some say you'll hear it. A low hum rising from the soil. 7 voices blending into one, whispering the same word they whispered half a century ago. Stay. End of record. The Darrington Children, 1971-2021. Case sealed. Origin unknown. Subject ongoing.